Okay, so here's the deal. We are on the rendering portion of this task. And right now we're blocking in. I'm going to remind you what I said about how our technique hasn't changed, right? Our technique from like finding the contour of the hair and adding the mass of the hair, that hasn't changed. It's just now that all of those contours and masses are much, much smaller. So we've got our eye blocked in. And for the eyelid, it's a two-part thing, right? What I want to do is think about a couple things. One is the interior shape of the eyelid, okay? So what you'll notice is that the lower lid a lot of times is more round, kind of to the outside here, and the upper lid is more round to the center. And that's because the eyeball sits high in the socket, right? So everyone's eyes are shaped a little different. And here's another clue. Your eyelids are probably not symmetrical. Like, you know, one of my eyes is more closed. One here, this one is a little more flat. That one's a little more round, right? So if your eyes don't look exactly the same, that's probably because you're paying attention to the way that your eyes actually look, okay? So what I want is, I can very lightly, if I want to guide, I can very lightly draw the shape of the lid that I want on my eyeball. Sometimes that can be a little dangerous if you get it a little deep, but I can. And what you'll notice is that I'm looking at the lid, the opening of the lid in relationship to the socket. So here's the cheekbone, right? Cheekbone. Brow ridge. You see how much space there is between the point of the brow ridge and the top of the lid, and between the top of the cheekbone and the bottom of the lid, right? Like, these things aren't, they're relatively closed to the full size of the eyeball. So your eyelids close like this. Top one goes over the lower one. It makes sense, right? Because if it went this way, then all the dust and rain would go down in. So we want to start adding the clay from the bottom meaning what's under spatially. So we're going to add the lower lid first, and then the upper lid. Because in the corners, the upper lid overlaps the lower lid, like that, okay? So lower lid I treat like a little worm. And remember, what we want is like the sense of light and shadow on it. Okay, we want the sense that the lid is on the outside of the eyeball. So my goal here isn't going to be to my goal here isn't going to be to make an ultra thin eyelid. My goal here is going to be create an eyelid that feels thin but is thick enough to catch a little shadow, right? So now, before I actually put that clay in, I'm going to look at the shape of the eye, and I'm going to very carefully, without scratching my eyeball, use my tool to move that clay around. And I can see right here, see how it's like a wall? That shadow, it's like a wall that moves up and around. So I want that sense of wall there, and I'm just going to clip that edge off. I want that lid moving up and around. Okay. Up and around. Great. Now, it's really important as you start to play with the eye that you don't move the tool back into the eyeball, right? We keep the tool really flat so that we're working between the lid We're working between the lid and the eyeball. Okay? So another thing you notice is, or that I notice is that depending on your model, you might have, there's a lot of flesh in the lids, right? So when they're open, sometimes we get like a pad of flesh up here and down here. So if there is any of that, I can go ahead and start to add little forms of clay to fill in any hollows I might have. All of this is going to depend on like age. It's going to depend on facial structure, right? But essentially what I'm doing is I'm looking at the light and shadow on my model, on my pictures, and I'm just trying to replicate that with forms. Okay? So watch, after you add that lid, watch for any other fleshy areas you might need to add. Okay? So see how the lid sticks out in front of the eyeball? Yeah. So for the upper lid, it's kind of the same thing, only it's usually you got to make your worm a little longer because that is more round, which means it has a longer length, right? Circumference versus a straight line. And the other thing I'm going to do is kind of pinch it a little bit wide, like kind of a rainbow with a flat bottom on it. And that flat bottom is going to be the part that's kind of like an eyelash. So then I will take and stick that in there. Kind of on an angle. See from the side how it's sitting just a little bit back, right? And then again, I'll make sure that the interior is where I want it by pushing it around. And then what you'll notice is the lid, when it opens, folds up under itself a lot of times, right? So I'm going to make that hard line right there. When I push that lid in, I'm going to let it fold up under itself. See that? So all of this is like the mass of the lid as it opens, and then this is just the edge that's underneath there. And I'm going to replicate what I see. And then all of this stuff, the top edge of it kind of sweeps up and starts to soften that brow ridge transition a little bit, right? It just sweeps up. So all of that extra biz of the lid okay. And you can play around with those forms. So what I'm noticing here is that I actually have a lot more, like, on my model, I have a lot more flesh right here. That's much more round, so I can go ahead and add that clay in there. And then if I'm getting the amount of clay right, all I should have to do is just manipulate the edges over a little bit rather than smashing that clay in. Okay. A couple things that make the eyeballs feel really naturalistic is making sure that it feels like, or is like, that the upper lid, right, dominates the lower lid, that it's over there, right? And having having a sense of the arches being a little different. So another thing to notice is that most of the time, the upper part of the iris is covered. On some people, and then most of the time, a lot of times, both sides of the iris are covered. Some people, the bottom of the iris shows up. Some people, like, both sides show up. Usually the top is covered a little bit, and that's because the eye is high in the socket. So when I think about that, one of the things I want to do is set the gaze, right? So to do that, I'm going to think about where that iris is, and I can just start to use the back of this tool, right? And start to create a little edge. And if I start to the interior and then the exterior, right, I can get a sense of light. Do you see that little bit of the edge of the iris in there? I know it's hard. See that? Okay. That's a very cold kind of eye. A great tool for making an expressionistic eye is your needle tool. So if you want a more expressionistic eye, go into the eyeball a little high, and you just kind of open it up. And that's a very, like, look how much light that catches. It's a very alive kind of eye, right? Just a nice hole in it. If you want to bring it back a little bit and make it like supernaturalistic, then you can take a little chunk of clay. I like to put it on the back of my tool, and I can insert it back in the eye. See how that changes it? And then set that in. So there's all kinds of ways that you can make your iris work to add more emotionality, make it a little more cold and Greek statue-like, right? So you can play around with it. And as we go, so now we've done, right? I don't like that. I'm gonna make it a little more expressionistic. Now we have essentially rough rendered all the parts of the face: nostril, tip of the nose, bridge of the nose, upper lip, lower lip, chin, fleshy pads, hair, ears. We talked about ears, right? And we've talked about this flashy strap that frames the mouth. Okay, so I want to get all of these forms in place. And then what I'll start to do is the last part of rendering, which is to start to bring them together so I don't have, gaps and holes in my clay, right? This is where I get to like Ultra HD 3K whatever, right? From 32-bit, 16-bit. So I make sure all the forms are in place and relatively right, and then I'll come through on a final pass and start to just bring all those edges together, paying attention to subtle shadows and all that kind of stuff, okay? So we're getting there. We're getting real, real close. All right. High def rendering next.